Hello, everyone. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal podcast, and the audio sounded funny to me for some reason, and I wanted to grab that before we got started. I'm looking at my phone. There's so much kind of breaking news and updates and things going on. It's a little bit crazy. Lots happening this week. First of all, I want to remind everyone, if you are not signed up for the Saturday newsletter, you should be. We did a good one this week on Venezuela, on Minnesota, with tons of links, all this type of thing. So if you want the best of the Cameron Journal and my unique commentary delivered right to your inbox, you're going to want to go to CameronJournal.com/newsletter or CameronJournal.substack.com and sign up there for that. That'll be really awesome, wonderful, and amazing. The other thing that you're also going to want to do is make sure to follow me on all of your favorite social media platforms at Cameron Cowan on Twitter, Instagram, Cameron O'Cowan on Facebook, all that type of thing. All those links are at CameronJournal.com as well. Big shout out to all my Cameron Journal Plus subscribers. Thank you so much for pledging to support this journalism. I really appreciate it. If you want to sign up for Cameron Journal Plus, it's $5 a month or a basic subscription on Substack, whichever platform you choose, and you get to be part of my exclusive Discord. And I will be attempting to launch a special edition of the newsletter here soon for Cameron Journal Plus subscribers only. But you do get the Discord, you do get priority answers on your comments, and all this sort of thing. So you get to hang out with me and ask me stuff on Discord, and I might go live from time to time. And I'd love to do little hangouts with people, so I'm trying to develop that. So if you think that's fun and you want to get on the Discord action, please sign up for Cameron Journal Plus, CameronJournal.com/subscribe. Now, all that having been said, let's dive into the headlines. It's a Monday. It's late. Let's get going. Let me do this, and let me change to this, and let me get rid of this, and let me change this overlay from this to this, because this is the right show. And then we'll also change this to Minnesota and Renee. Good. Here we go. All right. So, in case you haven't heard or have been living under a rock or whatever have you, Renee Good was a woman who was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and was shot last week by ICE. I'm sure we've all seen a dozen million angles. I included 6 different videos in the newsletter on Saturday of how all that went down. The details are rather unclear. Some say that she was in the neighborhood near where ICE was operating to antagonize ICE and to be aggressive and protest against them. Not a crime. Some other people say she was just dropping off her kid and got caught up in a situation she had no idea about. But the reality is that ICE was there. ICE surrounded her vehicle. One officer told her to get moving. Another officer told her to get out of the car and stay put. The officer, Jonathan Ross, who told her to get out of the car, ended up holding his cell phone and shooting her in the face. And we don't have footage of this shot, but he was holding his cell phone while he was doing it. That's one of the angles we've been looking at. This one is an angle from someone else in the street, and I thought it would be good to play a different angle that you might not have seen before. So let's watch.
Can I go check
so this is the aftermath. This is her car here. After she shot, her dead body obviously smashes the gas and drives off right into this light pole. And this is an angle from the immediate aftermath.
Back up now! I'm a physician.
Hey,
we understand. We got EMS coming. I get it. Just give us a second. We have medics on scene. We have our own medics.
Where are they? Where are they? How can I relax? You just killed my fucking neighbor. You caught butter in the fucking face. You killed my fucking neighbor.
Someone also said
You're killing
apparently
my
they were
neighbors.
a
You're stealing my
doctor.
neighbors. What the fuck, man?
Someone also said they were a physician on scene and were denied help. Um, so this obviously has been a big national story. It's been quite controversial. A lot of people have been talking about this and this story, including the president, who had these remarks to say.
It was highly disrespectful of law enforcement. The woman and her friend were highly disrespectful of law enforcement. You saw that. They were harassing them, were following for days and for hours. And I think, frankly, they're professional agitators. And I'd like to find out, and we are going to find out, who's paying for it. With their brand new signs and all the different things. But these are professional agitators, and law enforcement should not be in a position where they have to put up with this stuff. What that woman and what her friend and what their other friends were doing to law enforcement, not just ICE, law enforcement is outrageous.
Do you believe that deadly force?
And so, yeah, that there's no proof that she was following them for long periods of time. That has been posited that they were. Has been this narrative that they were agitators, protesters. According to Renee Good's ex-husband, she was not political in any way, was not into being an activist sort of thing. She had divorced her husband and had started a relationship with another woman. She also had a history of mental health problems and substance abuse as well. Some people are also using that against her, as people will do, of course. But it was the type of callous remark that we have grown to appreciate from President Trump, and this idea that somehow they weren't respectful is kind of absurd, given that the last words she said were "I'm not mad at you." As I said, this has again been a huge, absolutely massive national story. I wrote extensively about it on the newsletter, and what we do know, what we don't know, and what will come out. It is, and I'm not saying that there aren't people who protest against ICE. There were large protests in New York City today. I'm not saying that there aren't people who go up and try to stop what ICE is doing. There definitely are, and there have been people who have actively done that. There's just no real proof that that's what she was doing. It seems like she was a bit of a passerby. That may not come out to be true. It may come out that she was indeed trying to antagonize ICE. All that being said, I don't know that any of those actions justifies deadly force by the power of the state. And that was one of the things I mentioned at the end of the newsletter on Saturday, is that whether you agree with what ICE does or not is fine. You're welcome to have your own opinion on that. However, when you start having state power, government actors out here in the world shooting people like this, regardless of whether you agree with them or not, it's not necessarily a good thing for a country that's predicated on rights, liberties, and democracies. That's not a good idea. Not going to be a positive thing. And the fact that there's very little sympathy from the top on this, and rather the importance how inconvenienced law enforcement was, is quite indicative of where the White House is with all this and what they do and do not care about all of this. And it's quite obvious that they care quite little. So I'm not going to dig into that story any further because it's already been talked about a great deal. If you want to see the commentary in full, I would encourage you to go check out the newsletter. It's on the front page of my Substack right now, CameronJournal.substack.com. It's also still on the front page of the Cameron Journal because we haven't published much today, and it was the last thing that went out. So I would encourage you to go there and read that, and don't forget to subscribe. However, the other big story brewing, we're gonna get to Iran and the protests that are happening there. I've been trying to get in geopolitical expert Michael Susan to come on and do a special live to talk about Iran. He's been super busy, but as much as the death of Renee Good is terrible, the international situation is shaping up quite quickly, and it's the world is changing quite rapidly. And last week I did a big article called "Our New Multipolar World," and this is really emblematic of where things are going. So, as you might have also heard, the president is trying to annex Greenland again, saying it is essential, it's strategic, it has to happen. There's currently talks in Brussels and Europe of putting troops in Greenland to try to stop any sort of military action by the United States in Greenland, and the situation is now quite tense. However, this person offered an interesting perspective um, that could be quite interesting. There's no evidence this is possible, but I thought it was an interesting thing to think about. And it's in response to a story. Denmark is urging EU troop deployments into Greenland to counter U.S. President Trump's annexation plan. Britain, Germany, and France are reportedly in talks to deploy joint military forces to Greenland as a deterrent, as I just said. This person said this actually looks less like Europe reacting against the U.S. and more like the U.S. and Europe moving in parallel, even if it doesn't look coordinated on the surface. By pushing Greenland into the open and framing it as a security issue, Washington effectively forces the alliance to clarify lines, tighten coordination, and get serious about posture. Europe's response isn't defiance as much as synchronization, aligning UK, France, and Germany planning inside a NATO framework so nothing drifts into ambiguity. Seen that way, the noise is useful. It gives Europe political cover to accelerate military coordination, logistics, and readiness without having to say the quiet part out loud, that the Russia-Ukraine war isn't winding down and may require deeper, faster alliance involvement. The U.S. benefits from that outcome. A more organized, self-starting Europe makes escalation less unilateral, keeps deterrence collective, and reduces the risk of NATO looking fragmented at the worst possible moment. So rather than a standoff, this feels like managed friction. Public tension that catalyzes private alignment. Greenland becomes the headline, but the real effect is a tighter, more prepared alliance moving in the same direction. I'm not quite sure I buy that. I think it's a much more antagonistic situation than this person wants to let on to, especially given the why and the how Trump brought this up and why it seems to be so important, now at this particular juncture. Um, I think that is a quite interesting and fascinating dynamic, and I just don't think it's a everyone moving in the same direction. I think it's Trump saying, look, we want Greenland, we need Greenland to counter the Russian Arctic threat, we're taking Greenland, or you can take money for it or you can just lose it, but either way we're going to have Greenland. I even saw a passing headline that said there's a resolution in Congress to annex Greenland and grant them statehood. Puerto Rico, eat your heart out. This is a nice idea, but I think ultimately impractical. This is probably the biggest thing to fracture the transatlantic alliance since World War II. Um, and as I was talking about with our new global world, our new multipolar world, this is very emblematic of what conflict and war is going to look like moving forward and well into the future, which also brings us to this post from Dave Troy, who runs his own kind of little news outfit called America 2.0. And he is saying his investigation finds that Trump's actions in Venezuela and Greenland are the product of a long-running Russian influence campaign that began during his first term. This is a comprehensive write-up of the facts we outlined earlier this week and which went viral. With all this evidence taken in totality, the long-term intent becomes obvious. John Bolton and Fiona Hill, like them or not, were the adults who blocked this in 2019. Now there are no adults, and Trump is once again vulnerable to Putin's provocations and other leverage he can bring to bear. This is Putin's last-ditch effort to secure Ukraine, and it's unclear it can work. But he's taken this gamble, and we're all hostages. It would also be worth asking Lev Parnas about this and see if he tells the full story or dissembles. He plays a significant role in this set of operations. This piece is built on those research threads we assembled, which are also valuable resources. And it then starts into their research, their fact gathering, and some other people who've mentioned it along the way, which incidentally kind of gets into I don't necessarily want to dig into all of this. I could do a whole show on this, but I wanted to mention this as a kind of a jumping off place of a lot of the moves that America's making certainly are to Putin's advantage. A lot of them, like Greenland, are not to Putin's advantage. So it's kind of hard to pin this on Putin. Venezuela would sort of make sense, except that Putin was backing Venezuela. Now, however, if you want to come along and say, "Oh, well, Putin wants the U.S. distracted by Venezuela and things in our own sphere of influence, so that we pay less attention to Russia, or let him have Ukraine, all this type of thing," that's a little bit more plausible. But the reality, all of this is the new order, the old order is gone, the new order is changing, and I enjoyed this New York Times opinion piece from Sarang Shador. It was the director of the Global South program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, and writes about politics a lot. It says here, before the Trump administration turned its attention to Venezuela, its major act of global disruption was a suite of tariffs. Yet when they were unleashed on the world, it was shocking but not surprising. After all, President Trump and his advisors had long promoted tariffs as a silver bullet for the American economy. The world's reaction, however, was a surprise. Practically no one, China and Canada aside, retaliated. Instead, many countries lined up to sign deals with the United States, often putting themselves at a disadvantage. Some, such as Malaysia and Cambodia, even embraced intrusive clauses that govern their economic relations with other countries. Global responses were also generally muted to America's other acts of rebellion, quitting the World Health Organization, UNESCO, and the Paris Climate Agreement, dismantling the U.S. foreign aid program, and forcing deep cuts to the United Nations. Recently expanded bans on travel to America, mostly targeting Africa, have been greeted rather gently across much of the continent. A similar caution surrounds the kidnapping of Nicolas Maduro. Yet this apparent capitulation conceals a deeper development. Though the United States remains very powerful and able to bend others to its will, its days of unipolar supremacy are past. The Trump administration's aggression is best understood as a whiplash of extreme unilateralism. Indeed, new patterns of interaction are becoming visible in the fog. As America's global reign fades, a new world is taking shape, whether Washington likes it or not. With its tariff blitz, America struck at the very foundations of globalization, but notwithstanding claims of a new global template, the rest of the world, especially countries in the global south, is carrying on with and even deepening trade integration. There are exceptions like Mexico, but in 2025, new bilateral trade pacts were signed by countries as diverse as Canada, India, Indonesia, Malaysia, New Zealand, and Peru. Regional blocs were also active. China and the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, deepened their long-standing free trade agreement to cover digital and green sectors. The European Union began integration talks with a major trans-Pacific bloc and brought close to passage a landmark trade agreement with Mercosur, the main South American one. Globalization may now be a dirty word in America, but for most of the world, it's still very much alive. Defying the idea of win-win trade, the United States has pushed asymmetric deals on critical minerals, constraining the autonomy of some resource-rich countries. But American coercion is far from the whole story. Taking a cue from Chile and Indonesia's successful development of rich reserves of lithium and nickel, Vietnam and Zimbabwe have ramped up a similar effort on their minerals. Countries in the Sahel have even nationalized Western-owned mining assets. America's hostility towards the energy transition, too, has been met mostly with a shrug. China is now the undisputed giant of renewables, and the global south is following its lead on adopting green tech. Nepal, Singapore, Thailand, Uruguay, Vietnam, and others are leaving the United States in the dust on electric vehicle sales. Africa and South Asia, for their part, are seeing surges in solar installations. Meanwhile, a group of mostly developing countries known as BRICS continues to defend the idea of multilateralism. Last year's accession of Indonesia to the group and the addition of Malaysia, Thailand, and Nigeria, among others as partner countries, has enhanced its credibility and reach. Though BRICS will have to be nimble to overcome the challenge of America first and remains far from unified, it offers an arena for collaboration and cooperation outside America's ambit. Parts of Latin America, it's true, are steadily coming under Washington's shadow in the reactionary revival of the Monroe Doctrine, something the overthrow of Mr. Maduro makes all too clear, but the rest of the world is beginning to strike out in the opposite direction. In this, the United States' push for allies in Europe to do more for their own defense may be a blessing in disguise. The continent is finally being forced to confront the trade-off between deterring Russia and finding a sustainable peace in Ukraine. but it's Asia where the most interesting developments are. Hedging between China and the United States, many Asian countries continue to welcome Beijing in regional efforts to find solutions to conflicts, yet they also are concluding a flurry of new bilateral security pacts to counter China's overbearing presence and are hard at work strengthening their own defense capabilities as the more reliable way to raise costs for a would-be aggressor. The picture, while still emerging, is neither a resurrection of the old order nor a construction of a brand new one. Instead, the nascent new order is a mishmash of many ingredients and flavors, rather like the Indian dish of kimchi. It may look messy, but it detoxifies the body and builds resilience. A world in this mold will be less top-down and more self-organized, driven more by pragmatism than ideology. In such a future, the Group of 20 and BRICS could emerge as coordinating bodies for crisis management at the global level, ideally complementary to a reformed United Nations, but a lot of the actions likely to come from enterprising countries and not just the bigger ones. Small island nations already punch above their weight on climate, for example. The formation of a new group of open trading states, among them Morocco, Costa Rica, and Norway, shows the promise of things to come. The reconfiguration of the world beyond the United States will not be seamless, of course. There will be many twists and turns on the way, including conflict and instability, but the emergence of a new order has really been orderly. Why would this time be different? And that, regardless of the influence of Putin on Greenland and Venezuela and everything happening now that John Bolton and others were stopping, is honestly really the story here. And it's something I knew this day would come. I did. I'm surprised it's happening now. I think it's interesting that it's happening now, that we're sort of reflexively going back to the old the old method, the old way of doing things, the old ideas, and we are going back to our isolationist roots. I think it leaves the world a poorer place. But the reality, I think, and someone had mentioned this a while ago, that the reality is that we would rather manage the end of unipolarity than be a victim of it. And I think the Trump administration is trying to, one, reset the order on the economy, because the whole world economy is predicated on we buy your stuff, you sell us stuff, and we export our currency. They're trying to reset on that, but I think they're also trying to redefine where we have our most influence. However, the person that benefits most from that is actually not Beijing. It's Russia. Do with that information what you will. That all being said, there's definitely an interesting dynamic at play, and this post really kind of brought this to the fore. Is that it's incredibly frightening how, mostly in private, our military leaders, the American elite, and the intelligence adjacent, and the generally in the know all seem to say that Cold War II has already begun. To the point, this has been happening for a while. I think there was an inflection point after COVID and has continued to ramp up. And there's this anecdote from Niall Ferguson in 2023 that says, "I'll tell you a little anecdote, Peter. When I first started thinking about this in 2018, I had to summon up the courage to ask Kissinger, are we in a Cold War? And I asked him actually in China at a conference in late 2019, and he gave a great reply. He said, we are in the foothills of a Cold War. A year later, he upgraded that in 2020 to be the mountain passes of a Cold War. When I asked him about it last year, he said, almost taking it for granted that we're in Cold War II, and the new Cold War would be worse. Would be, to be precise, more dangerous than the first one. So I'm not just meaning this, I'm basing this partly on his insights." And I thought that was an excellent way to kind of cap off our little, our little, our little international segment here, is that things have changed. The world has changed. And we now need to be mindful that we're in a new and very different geopolitical environment than we have been in since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I think the sooner we are mindful of that, the better off we will all be. I think there's a lot of danger ahead, and that that I think should give us all a great deal of pause. Now, in this segment, I also mentioned things that were going on in Iran, and I want to talk about that. I'm going to save a lot of the history of the present situation for hopefully a future live with Michael Susan, who is a wonderful expert on this stuff. And he will talk more about what's happening on the ground. But in case you haven't heard, there have been absolutely massive protests in Iran. The video we're watching is protests from last night where 1 million people in Tehran were in the streets. The government has cut off the internet. They have cut off the electricity. The only video we're getting out is what's coming out via Starlink. And so there is, and they're even trying to interrupt that with Russian technology. So they're doing everything they can to try to shut this down. But the reality is, it's been 2 weeks of consistent, sustained protests. The general consensus is that the regime in Tehran is in deep trouble. And the mainstream media really hasn't been on this story, but they're finally starting to pick it up. Finally starting to pick it up and show that things are already changing in a big way. In my research for tonight's show, I didn't grab the video, but there was this kind of on the ground expert guy who's kind of like, no, this is all propaganda. This isn't, anything, real. The regime is fine. Everything here is fine. There's probably some truth to that. It's hard to tell if you're not there, and I'll give him credit. He's closer to the problem than I am. But again, I also happen to know people in the know, and it's not looking good. So, yeah. I mean, in this all this light you're seeing is people holding up their cell phones. Those are all cell phones. Points of light. Cell phones. That's it's quite a sight. It's absolutely quite a sight. There's even the protests have spread to every city, every province. There's women who are taking off their head coverings and are shaking their hair in the street. All their attempts to repress these protests have not worked. People are not stopping going out and demanding change and demanding democracy. There is a rumor, but it is only a rumor, that U.S. strikes in Iran are imminent. Then there's a rumor, only a rumor, that there's nuclear material missing, about 10 kilograms of it, that was supposed to have been destroyed during our bombings of Iran earlier this year and is just gone. They're currently looking for it. The situation in Iran is active and potentially collapsing. So in the midst of what are we going to do with Venezuela, global multipolar realignment, Iran's also falling apart. The geopolitical chessboard is being moved around every single day, literally as we speak. And that doesn't even get into what's happening on the Arabian Peninsula with the Saudis and the UAE going back and forth over Somaliland. Like I said, borders are being redrawn right now. Everything is up in the air. Keep your powder dry, folks. Back here at home, now that we've done the international segment, back here at home, we're going to briefly talk about what Zuck and Meta have been up to. And I've had this story for a couple weeks. I think this was dated late last year. Oh, it was dated in November. That's how long I've been sitting on this one. Court filings allege Meta downplayed risks to children and misled the public. It says here, sex trafficking, this is from Time magazine, sex trafficking on Meta platforms was both difficult to report and widely tolerated, according to a court filing unsealed Friday in a plaintiff's brief filed as part of a major lawsuit against 4 social media companies. Instagram's former head of safety and well-being, Vaishnavi Jayakumar, testified that when she joined Meta in 2020, she was shocked to learn the company had a 17-time strike policy for accounts that reportedly engaged in the trafficking of humans for sex. You could incur 16 violations for prostitution and sexual solicitation, and upon the 17th violation, your account would be suspended. Jay Kumar reportedly testified, adding that by any measure across the industry, it was a very, very high strike threshold. The plaintiffs claimed that this testimony is corroborated by internal company documentation. The brief, filed by plaintiffs in the Northern District of California, alleges that Meta was aware of serious harms on its platform and engaged in a broad pattern of deceit to downplay risks to young users. According to the brief, Meta was aware that millions of adult strangers were contacting minors on its sites, that its products exacerbated mental health issues in teens, and that content related to eating disorders, suicide, and child sexual abuse was frequently detected, yet rarely removed. According to the brief, the company failed to disclose these harms to the public or to Congress and refused to implement safety fixes that could have protected young users. Quote, Meta has designed social media products and platforms that is aware are addictive to kids. They're aware that those addictions lead to a whole host of serious mental health issues, said Previn Warren, the co-lead attorney for the plaintiffs in the case. Like tobacco, this is a situation where there are dangerous products that were marketed to kids, Warren adds. They did it anyway because more usage meant more profits for the company. The following allegations against Meta come from the brief filed in an unprecedented multi-district litigation. More than 1,800 plaintiffs, including children and parents, school districts, and state attorneys general, have joined together in a suit alleging that the parent companies behind Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, and YouTube relentlessly pursued a strategy of growth at all costs, recklessly ignoring the impact of their products on children's mental and physical health, according to the master complaint. The newly unsealed allegations about Meta are just one small part of the sprawling suit. Time filed a motion to intervene in the case to ensure public access to court records. The motion was denied. The plaintiff's brief, first reported by Time, purports to be based on sworn depositions of current and former Meta executives, internal communications, and company research and presentations obtained during the lawsuit's discovery process. It includes quotes and excerpts from thousands of pages of testimony and internal company documents. Time was not able to independently view the underlying testimony or research quoted in the brief since those documents remain under seal. But the brief still paints a damning picture of the company's internal research and deliberations about issues that have long plagued its platforms. Plaintiffs claim that since 2017, Meta has aggressively pursued young users, even as its internal research suggested social media products could be addictive and dangerous to kids. Meta employees proposed multiple ways to mitigate these harms, according to the brief, but were repeatedly blocked by executives who feared that new safety features would hamper teen engagement or user growth. And it goes on to detail into each of the allegations, into the issues with Instagram. I mean, it just goes on. It just goes on and on and on. And about they're not removing content and addictive product. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. I encourage you to read the whole thing if you're that curious. But the you've heard the bulk of it. Right now, this is winding its way through the courts. This lawsuit will probably never be a huge story. This should be an absolutely huge story. The fact that they're, basically wanting to, and it's suing everybody. It's Meta, it's Google, it's everybody that, these social media sites need to be made safe and brought to heel. This is the court case that will finally get probably some written regulation on what is and is not allowed on social media sites, similar to what Europe has. It's gonna be in court forever and a day because of free speech and all this sort of thing. But this is the start of that. There are aspects of this that are really good, like the sex trafficking, prostitution. Yeah, get rid of that immediately. Should already be gone. When it comes to harming children, yeah, that too. I mean, a lot of this stuff, it just should be common sense that you wouldn't want those things. Sex trafficking content, no. Instagram was letting adult strangers connect with teenagers, no. That's just, targeting young users. That one's an edge case. Could be good, could be bad, but knowing it's Meta, probably bad. And then not making Instagram less toxic for teens, bad. Automatically remove harmful content, nope, bad. Its products were addictive but downplayed the harms. Okay, that's cigarettes and tobacco again. All this sort of thing. I mean, a lot of this stuff is common sense. This will become a bigger thing as time goes on. As this court case gets moving forward, because it involves so many people, this is going to be like tobacco lawsuits, which were huge. And this will change how social media and the internet works. Simple as. Speaking of that, this story I also is kind of a holdover, and then we're going to talk about Jerome Powell. This story is kind of a holdover back before Christmas. As you may know, Barry Weiss was the editor of the Free Press and is now head of CBS News. And there have been multiple sort of early difficulties with her tenure at CBS News, including the blocking of a segment about the Renee Good shooting in Minnesota. But here we have cancel culture's boomerang effect. How we got to the place where free speech means whatever conservatives want to say. And it says here that, according to Sharon Alfonsi, the correspondent who reported the segment, the story had already been reviewed by CBS News' Legal and Standards Department before it was pulled. This is a segment about torture at the Seacott prison of migrants. And it said, our story was screened 5 times and cleared by both CBS attorneys and standards and practices. It is factually correct. Alfonsi wrote in an email that was leaked to the New York Times and other outlets. In my view, pulling it now after rigorous internal check has been met is not an editorial decision, it's a political one. The reason this whole saga is disturbing is that many observers, Alfonsi among them, interpret it as an instance of state censorship by proxy, the head of a news organization putting the brakes on a story the government would rather not air. Weiss was recently installed as the head of CBS News by Paramount's new owner, the pro-Trump billionaire David Ellison, which illustrates the risks of media consolidation, creating a single pressure point for an authoritarian government to coerce obedience if it so chooses. Editors, of course, hold or spike stories all the time, for many legitimate reasons, and although many newsrooms require review by legal and standards departments for the most complicated stories, editorial independence dictates that an editor makes the final call on whether a story should move forward, but Alfonsi's account calls Weiss's reasoning into question. By Monday night, the unpublished segment was circulating like samizdat on social media, yet another example of regular people demonstrating a greater commitment to democratic principles than America's leaders. Weiss has long been a vocal supporter of a curiously narrow definition of free speech. That hypocrisy shared by many brought to us where we are today. Nasty tweets were a harbinger of incipient totalitarianism, but now the Trump administration is trying to imprison and deport people for pro-Palestinian advocacy, and it's fine. The PC police were trying to outlaw make-believe, but when Republican states ban books from schools and public libraries, it's fine. These dumb lefties believe that words are violence, but when the federal government says left-wing speech is violence worthy of firing or prosecution, it's fine. Protests on college campuses were a national crisis, but now that the federal government wants to ensure that entire universities comply with right-wing ideology when it comes to whom they hire, what they teach, and whom they admit, it's fine. Social media-backed companies implementing moderation policies is censorship, but when those moderation policies favor right-wing speech and outright bigotry, it's fine. The illiberal left was leading an epidemic of self-censorship, but now that the owners of entire corporations compel their workers to shape content in order to win the favor of the right-wing president, it's fine. Liberal snowflakes on campus are trying to censor academic inquiry, but now the Trump administration is slashing funding for research it deems DEI and censoring museums and federal historical sites for being insufficiently jingoistic, and it's fine. We are rapidly approaching a system where the government uses its authority to decide which forms of speech are acceptable to publish or broadcast, and of course, that's fine. Why is any of this okay with those who once claimed to be free speech champions or absolutists? Because, quite obviously, they weren't. Many cannot claim to be less censorious than the progressives they criticize, given the clamorous demand for firing people for remarks at the assassination of Charlie Kirk, or demanding a boycott of Netflix for its LGBTQ content. The campaign against so-called cancel culture had an appeal to the chattering classes, myself included, because many of us found left-wing nastiness annoying, exhausting, and in some cases threatening. Amen. Recent MAGA defectors have learned that what the rest of us already knew. This is not a distinctly left-wing issue at all, and there were certainly those who believed, mistakenly I think, that censoriousness could be as dangerous as state censorship. But I argued at the time that the campaign was largely a pretext for placing left-wing speech beyond the protection of the First Amendment in order to justify state suppression, and events have borne that out. The reason so many of yesterday's free speech champions transitioned so easily into today's pro-Trump censors is that the definition of free speech never included the right of others to talk back. They were not defending a universal right to freedom of speech, they were defending a right to monologue. They could say what they want and you could shut up and like it. The cynicism of the effort can be known by its fruits: an administration that issues executive orders protecting free speech while engaging in the most sweeping campaign of state censorship since the Red Scare. To the extent that there is or was something distinct called cancel culture, harsh, even violent censoriousness has a long history in America. Its contemporary iteration is largely a creation of the perverse incentives of social media. Highlighting extreme and nasty behavior is the easiest way to keep people scrolling, posting, and interacting. That's a structural, not an ideological problem, and is not something that can be solved by purging or censoring one point of view. Every society that has ever existed has had views that are mainstream and views that are fringe. The free speech frauds who captured the discourse over the past decade understood this, but their true objection was that they did not unilaterally have the power to define which was which. For example, in a 2018 Times column, Weiss complained that leftists were engaged in a concerted attempt to significantly redraw the bounds of acceptable thought and speech. This was meant to sound sinister, menacing. In fact, this is politics. Every faction is always trying to redraw the bounds of acceptable thought and speech. In a free society, the government allows people to have those arguments. Such disputes are not a threat to free speech. They are free speech. When I say that CBS News' Barry Weiss understood this, you needn't take my word for it. In November, shortly after being given the reins to one of the oldest broadcast news organizations in the country, Weiss used identical language to describe her own project. Quote, I think it's about redrawing the lines of what falls in the 40-yard lines of acceptable debate and acceptable American politics and culture, Weiss said at the Jewish Leadership Conference. And I don't mean that in like a censorious gatekeeping way. What's the difference between her redrawing the lines of acceptable speech and other people doing it? What makes one censorious and the other gatekeeping and the other not? Well, because she gets to decide. That's what so much of the free speech panic was about, making sure the right people were in charge of what you see, hear, and read. Notably, this has very little to do with reporting the news, which is supposed to be what CBS News does. But if the point of installing Weiss was to ensure that she would gatekeep on behalf of right-wing interests, that is precisely what she appears to be doing. In that 2018 column, Weiss complained that so many people seem to believe the real cause for concern are the secret authoritarians passing as liberals and conservatives in our midst. Seems like they were right to be concerned. Upon reflection, her conclusion that misguided leftists were focusing on minor issues when there were true threats to freedom of speech was prescient. It applies neatly to the campus PC obsession that helped elevate Weiss to a position where she could block the publication of a story about the United States government rendering men to an overseas gulag without trial. I didn't necessarily read that the right way for the ending, but it was a good abrupt ending. Yeah, this is an interesting dynamic with cancel culture. Longtime readers and listeners will know I am not a fan of cancel culture. I've been complaining about it since 2018. I've been poking fun at it forever. I've written multiple articles on the subject, and I've talked about it on this show over and over and over. I talk to Trumpers and conservatives all the time. There are 325 episodes of the Cameron Journal podcast. Please go ahead and listen to them. Anyone who listens to the show at the time knows I am liberal, and I tend to be more liberal, but I don't suppose that anybody has to sit here and listen to a single thing I have to say. I don't suppose that I'm going to go out without attack for saying such things, and if you want that, check my comment section, especially on my shorts, which generate all sorts of comments, usually to do with my appearance, but also sometimes to do with my ideas, on the occasion. A lot of that had to do with the simple fact that people were being, deplatformed by major platforms. People felt that was unfair, and they're not wrong about that, because it wasn't even. Like, if you're going to deplatform for a reason, it has to apply to everyone. It did not apply to everyone. Platforms picked and chose, usually in a mob mentality. That's why the whole thing was bad and wrong. But now we've gotten the same thing in reverse. The very principle of the idea is what needs to die. It's not a matter of who's in charge of it. It's a matter that it exists at all. And this article in The Atlantic makes that point ever so presciently. And I'm glad that I finally got to talk about it, because we've been so busy with so many stories. I've been hanging on to this for weeks and weeks wanting to talk about it. And I'm just so glad we finally have, because it's time for us to get back to a place where we respect what people have to say. And most importantly, their right to say it. Now, platforms may get to pick and choose who gets to say that on their platform. That may be true. But people should be able to have their say, even if it's wrong. It's an important part of a free society. Now, speaking of free society, I want to jump right into, we're not going to start with that, we're going to start with this. We're going to jump right into the criminal referral of Jerome Powell at the Federal Reserve. Now, it says here, federal prosecutors open investigation into Fed Chair Powell, and we actually have a response video and a statement. The investigation, which is said to center on renovations of the Federal Reserve's headquarters in Washington, is an escalation of the president's long-run pressure campaign on Jerome Powell. The U.S. Attorney's Office in the District of Columbia has opened a criminal investigation into Jerome H. Powell, the Federal Reserve Chair, over the central bank's renovation of its Washington headquarters and whether Mr. Powell lied to Congress about the scope of the project, according to officials briefed on the situation. The inquiry, which includes an analysis of Mr. Powell's public statements and examination of spending records, was approved in November by Jeanine Pirro, a longtime ally of President Trump, who was appointed to run the office last year, the officials said. The investigation is a remarkable escalation in Mr. Trump's long-running pressure campaign on Mr. Powell, whom the president has continually attacked for resisting his demands to slash interest rates significantly. The president has threatened to fire the Fed chair, even though he nominated Mr. Powell for the position in 2017, and raised the prospect of a lawsuit against him related to the $2.5 billion renovation, citing incompetence. Mr. Trump told the New York Times in an interview last week that he had decided on who he wants to replace Mr. Powell as Fed chair. He expected soon to announce his decision, Kevin A. Hassett. Mr. Trump's top economic advisor is a frontrunner for the top job. While Mr. Powell's term as chair ends in May, his term as a governor runs through January 2028. Mr. Powell has not disclosed whether he plans to stay on at the central bank beyond this year. Mr. Powell, in a rare video message released by the Fed, acknowledged on Sunday the Justice Department had served the central bank with grand jury subpoenas days earlier. He described the investigation as unprecedented and questioned the motivation for the move, even as he affirmed that he carried out his duties as chair without political fear or favor. And if you want to know what that video was, we've got it right here.
Good evening. On Friday, the Department of Justice served the Federal Reserve with grand jury subpoenas, threatening a criminal indictment related to my testimony before the Senate Banking Committee last June. That testimony concerned in part a multi-year project to renovate historic Federal Reserve office buildings. I have deep respect for the rule of law and for accountability in our democracy. No one, certainly not the chair of the Federal Reserve, is above the law. But this unprecedented action should be seen in the broader context of the administration's threats and ongoing pressure. This new threat is not about my testimony last June or about the renovation of the Federal Reserve buildings. It is not about Congress's oversight role. The Fed, through testimony and other public disclosures, made every effort to keep Congress informed about the renovation project. Those are pretexts. The threat of criminal charges is a consequence of the Federal Reserve setting interest rates based on our best assessment of what will serve the public, rather than following the preferences of the president. This is about whether the Fed will be able to continue to set interest rates based on evidence and economic conditions, or whether instead monetary policy will be directed by political pressure or intimidation. I have served at the Federal Reserve under 4 administrations, Republicans and Democrats alike. In every case, I have carried out my duties without political fear or favor, focused solely on our mandate of price stability and maximum employment. Public service sometimes requires standing firm in the face of threats. I will continue to do the job the Senate confirmed me to do, with integrity and a commitment to serving the American people. Thank you.
And not only that, and there were no comments from Attorney General, this sort of thing, and it gets into Trump's larger class with the Fed and the whole renovations, which include the project involves expanding and modernizing the Mariner S. Eccles building and another building on Constitution Avenue, which date to the 1930s. These buildings have been renovated. The project started in 2022 and is set to be completed in 2027. However, this has also already caused a post on Substack signed by all the former chairs of the Federal Reserve and Treasury Secretaries and some other people who have issued this statement. The Federal Reserve's independence and public perception of that independence are critical for economic performance, including achieving the goals Congress has set for the Federal Reserve of stable prices, maximum employment, and moderate long-term interest rates. The reported criminal inquiry into Federal Reserve Chair Jay Powell is an unprecedented attempt to use prosecutorial attacks to undermine that independence. This is how monetary policy is made in emerging markets with weak institutions, with highly negative consequences for inflation and the functioning of their economies more broadly. It has no place in the United States, whose greatest strength is the rule of law, which is at the foundation of our economic success. And, yeah, it was that was being passed around passed around this morning, and this, uh, um, yeah, there's a lot of issues. Apparently, the project is $700 million over budget. The 2021 version of the Fed's proposal described private elevators and dining rooms for top policymakers, water fountains, and new marble features, in addition to a rooftop terrace for staff. Pressed at a congressional hearing in June, Mr. Powell denied that many of those features were part of the latest proposal. There's no VIP dining room, there's no new marble, he said. We took down the old marble, we're putting it back up. We'll have to use new marble where some of the old marble broke, but there's no special elevators. There's just old elevators that have been there. Mr. Powell added that the project's plans had continued to evolve and that some features that had been initially incorporated were scrapped. After Mr. Powell's testimony, the Fed published a frequently asked questions post on its website that reaffirmed Mr. Powell's answers to lawmakers. In explaining the cost overruns, the central bank has cited expenses tied to materials, equipment, and labor, as well as unforeseen circumstances such as more asbestos than anticipated and soil contamination. And they're also removing lead contamination. They're also doing disability access as well. And there's also the other case with Lisa D. Cook, a governor of the central bank, and the Supreme Court will hear her case on January 21st. Trump tried to fire her over the allegations of mortgage fraud, and their lower court already allowed her to stay in her job. So it's and Senator Tom Tillis, Republican of North Carolina, and a member of the Banking Committee, vowed to oppose the confirmation of any nominee for the Fed, including any coming chair vacancy, citing reports of subpoenas. Quote, if there was any remaining doubt whether advisors in the Trump administration are actively pushing to end the independence of the Federal Reserve, there should now be none, he said in a statement. It is now the independence and credibility of the Department of Justice that are in question. So this is a bigger story. It should be a bigger story than it won't be. To say that, there was construction overruns and errors and you misused money poorly on this renovation project as a pretense for criminal prosecution to hope to get him out of the chairmanship, which ends in 4 months, is a bit short-sighted politically on Trump's part, and I think is just generally unnecessary. When you have two buildings that are that old and you have asbestos and lead, who knows how much it's all going to cost? There's nothing saying that he's pocketing extra money. If the project went over budget, until he's been stealing money, I kind of care a lot less about it. In terms of whether he's doing anything wrong. This is obviously political. Everyone sees it for what it is. And it will be interesting to see how that develops over time. And to see what happens with this in the courts, and most importantly, how other politicians react to it. Tom Tillis has already gone on the record saying, we know what this is. Well, here we are. It says here, Trump says civil rights led to white people being very badly treated. President Trump's comments were a blunt distillation of his administration's racial politics, which rest on the belief that white people have become the real victims of discrimination in America. President Trump said in an interview that he believes civil rights era protections result in white people being, quote, very badly treated, unquote. His strongest indication that the concept of reverse discrimination is driving his aggressive crusade against diversity policies. Speaking to the New York Times on Wednesday, Mr. Trump echoed grievances amplified by Vice President J.D. Vance and other top officials who in recent weeks have urged white men to file federal complaints with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. When asked whether protections that began in the 1960s, spurred by the passage of the Civil Rights Act, had resulted in discrimination against white men, Mr. Trump said he believed a lot of people were very badly treated. White people were very badly treated, where they did extremely well and they were not invited to go into a university or college, he said, in apparent reference to affirmative action in college admissions. So I wanted to say in that way, I think it was unfair in certain cases. He added, I think it was also at the same time, it accomplished some very wonderful things, but it also hurt a lot of people. People that deserve to go to a college, deserve to get a job, were unable to get a job. So it was reverse discrimination. Mr. Trump's comments were a blunt distillation of his administration's racial politics, which rests on the belief that white people become the real victims of discrimination in America. During his campaign for president, Mr. Trump harnessed a political backlash to Black Lives Matter and other protests, saying there was a definite anti-white feeling in this country, and he joined his base in denouncing what he deemed to be woke policies. The Trump administration has claimed that eradicating policies that promote diversity would shepherd in a merit-based society. But for civil rights leaders, Mr. Trump's remarks showed that the perceived plight of white men were the true focus. Derek Johnson, the president of the NAACP, the nation's oldest civil rights organization, said there was, quote, no evidence that white men were discriminated against as a result of the civil rights movement, the Civil Rights Act, and efforts to rectify the long history of this country denying access to people based on race in every measurable category. Within hours of taking office, Mr. Trump ordered the dismantling of diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts that were responsible for addressing systemic discrimination against minorities and women. And last year, he ordered federal agencies to halt enforcement of core tenets of the Bedrock Civil Rights Act. He has gone on. Now, that's not all Trump's fault. The Supreme Court's been undermining that too, like on disparate impact and all that sort of thing. It's not just the Trump administration. Let's be clear about that. And the New York Times should have been too. He has gone on to equate diversity with incompetence and inferiority and cast himself as the protector of white people both at home and abroad. Asked on Wednesday whether his immigration agenda was aimed at making the country whiter, Mr. Trump said he wanted people, quote, that love our country, unquote. It's very simple, said Mr. Trump, who carved out exceptions to his crackdown on refugee admissions for mostly white South Africans. I want people that love our country. Carrying out Mr. Trump's agenda is the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, which formed in 1965 under the Civil Rights Act. The commission's chair, Andrea Lucas, issued a striking video message last month underlining the agency's new posture. Are you a white male who's experienced discrimination at work based on your race or sex? Ms. Lucas said in the video posted on X, you may have a claim to recover money under federal civil rights laws. Contact the EEOC as soon as possible. Time limits are typically strict for filing a claim. The EEOC is committed to identifying, attacking, and eliminating all forms of race and sex discrimination, including against white male applicants and employees. In the video, Mr. Lucas pointed white men to the Commission's FAQ on DEI-related discrimination, which notes that DEI, a broad term that is not defined in the Civil Rights Act. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission is the nation's primary litigator of workplace discrimination, and for decades has been a resource for minorities, women, and other groups who have historically faced discrimination. But Ms. Lucas has endeavored to make it one of Mr. Trump's most powerful tools against DEI, with a particular focus on remedying the perceived harms against white men. And it says here at the end that, quote, I've never seen in the history of an agency a blanket request to only one racial group and gender to contact the chair's office directly to raise concerns about discrimination, said Jenny R. Yang, a former chair of the commission. That raises significant concerns. And I thought it was a kind of an interesting stop on talking about what's happening with the Trump administration and DEI. A lot of that stuff has kind of fallen off the radar, given everything else that is going on and that we even talked about tonight. But they're still hard at work. They're still busy doing stuff. So our next story is Pence eyes comeback as Project 2025 War Room implodes. It says here, former Vice President Mike Pence is poaching top names from the Heritage Foundation of Project 2025 infamy as he scales up another political comeback. Pence, 66, is building, practically young as politicians go these days, is building up his own think tank, Advancing American Freedom, which will oppose tariffs, isolationism, and big government populism, he told the Wall Street Journal. A friend turned foe of President Donald Trump said his group will stop propping up MAGA figures like Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who lacks a medical background, and will push to strengthen support of Ukraine. Pence said the Heritage Foundation, an influence behind much of Trump's policy this year, has been, quote, abandoning its principles, unquote, and has fallen for altering its stance on the above issues. Quote, why these people are coming our way is that Heritage and some other voices and commentators have embraced big government populism and have been willing to tolerate anti-Semitism, Pence told the Journal. The Washington-based Advancing American Freedom is reportedly hiring 15 people from the Heritage Foundation, including John Malcolm, head of the Foundation's Legal and Judicial Studies Center, Kevin Diaratna, head of the Data Analysis Center, and Richard Stern, director of its Economic Policy Studies Institute. The Journal reports that 7 other staffers jumping ship are from Malcolm's team. Those departures have not sat well with the Heritage Foundation, which accused its fellow Republicans of disloyalty. Heritage's Chief of Advancement Officer, Alani Olivastro, further alleged that some of those departing were fired first. Malcolm and other staffers were terminated for conduct inconsistent with Heritage's mission and standards last week, Olivastro said. He did not elaborate on exactly what the staffers did to get canned. Our mission is unchanged. Our leadership is strong and decisive, Heritage said in a statement. Heritage has always welcomed debate, but alignment on mission and loyalty to the institution are non-negotiable. A handful of staff chose a different path, some through disruption, others through disloyalty. Other MAGA figures, including Donald Trump Jr., also weighed in on the intra-party civil war. Personally, I think it's great news for Heritage that a bunch of Trump-hating rhinos are leaving, the president's eldest child posted to X. Anyone who'd want to go to work for Mike Pence's globalist Never Trump organization isn't MAGA and definitely doesn't put America first. The right-wing political consultant Alex Dershowitz agreed. He wrote, quote, "Word on the street is that some of the staffers leaving the Heritage Foundation are heading to Mike Pence's organization. Congrats to @Heritage. The clowns are leaving their organization. These departures will open up jobs for patriots who believe in America first." I mean, it isn't running for office, isn't really a political comeback, but it's definitely representative of a certain type of the Republican Party that is not MAGA aligned. And as the party begins to move on from MAGA and all this type of thing, people like Mike Pence will be the ones trying to clean up in donor money and trying to get influence on the next leaders coming out of MAGA. And I think a lot of donors are going to want someone who's going to be representing a reset in what the Republican Party has been for the last decade. And clearly, Mike Pence thinks he can be the center of that. Hey, donate the player, hate the game. You know what? It's 8 minutes after the hour, and I'm gonna stop there tonight on Mike Pence. Let me quit that real fast. I'm gonna stop there with good old Mike Pence. And we're gonna call it a night tonight. It's been a long day for me. I'm pretty tired anyway. So let me catch up with you all soon. My name is Cameron Cowan. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. You can catch me online at CameronJournal.com. All my social links are there. You can also catch me on Substack, CameronJournal.substack.com. This is the Cameron Journal Newshour. I'm every Mondays at 7 p.m. and I will look forward to talking to you all very, very soon. I'll see you next Monday now. Have a great night, everyone. Good night.